Today I'm speaking with Jane Metcalfe. She's the former president and co-founder of Wired Magazine. Prior to that, she and her co-founder started TCHO Chocolates. And in 2017, Jane founded Neo.Life, a web-based and email magazine that focuses on people, companies, and biological technologies that are improving, repairing, and extending life. Thank you so much for being here, Jane. It's so lovely to connect with you as always. And you are always doing really fascinating things. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Maya. I'm delighted to be invited.
So the first thing I wanted to ask you was, can you tell us what the neobiological revolution is?
Yes. Well, I consider it the sort of logical next phase of the digital revolution. So the digital revolution, which is a phrase my partner Lewis coined literally 27 years ago, was designed to describe the ways technology was going to transform the way we did business and the way we did education and how we both created and experienced entertainment, communications technologies. It changed, finance and investing, and obviously it changed our civic participation. All of which I consider now sort of externalities, if you will. And, we got to the point where it was about stickiness, and I think it's still about stickiness. And so it's like, I kept looking about 5 years ago, it's like, what comes next? What is the next stage of the digital revolution? Or put another way, what is the next aspect of our lives that it's going to completely transform? And so to me, the neobiological revolution is about how we're using those technologies to transform ourselves, to go inside the human body, inside living things in general, bacteria and viruses and algae and fungus and all those things, to really bring the kind of engineering mentality to biology.
Engineering biology. So can you tell us about your idea for Neo.Life, and what is Neo.Life, and how can we find it?
Right. Yeah. So, as a journalist, it's kind of an extraordinary thing to be standing in front of the next story, of our times. To see this twice in one lifetime is something I never really expected. In fact, I thought I was done with journalism entirely. When last seen, I was a chocolate maker on the waterfront in San Francisco. But, it just dawned on me. I was experiencing, well, for one thing, I was looking at the food industry and how it was being transformed. I was dealing with chocolate, which is, a sacred plant and an incredibly interesting molecule that has in and of itself its own, curative properties or cardioprotective properties, or it can stimulate your brain for focus or concentration. It can trigger your neurotransmitters like anandamide, which floods your body with a sense of love. And so the science of food and food molecules was something that was, churning in my head. And at the same time, we were working on a sourcing program using technology to help farmers make better cocoa beans, amazingly enough, which really was just about teaching them better fermentation, how to control fermentation better. And then I started thinking about chocolate as a carrier for nutraceuticals, or, along the lines of sacred plants. We had people saying, what about peyote? What about psilocybin? What about cannabis? None of which was going to work on the molding lines we were using to ship millions of bars of chocolates to Starbucks. But, it did get me thinking about those molecules and how would, this magical theobromine interact with something like peyote or whatever. And of course, we know that chocolate and psychedelics go very nicely together. And of course, we also know that chocolate and magic go together. So that's kind of cool. So I was thinking about food. I was thinking about transformational technologies for food systems, visibility through the supply chain, the sort of chain of custody, and how could we know that these really special flavor beans that Jose had, given us from plot number 72 in Ecuador, had actually made it all the way through our manufacturing process into this particular chocolate bar. And, today, of course, we have, there's a Rebel Bio company that has that kind of biological signature that's now being stamped. So instead of an RFID tag, it's like a CRISPR-based DNA tag that you can include. So anyway, but those things started me thinking about science and nutrition and food systems at the same time as I have three elders, mother, father, and a stepfather, and they all fell into cognitive decline or mental health challenges or a psychotic breakdown because the cognitive decline meant they were no longer taking their medication. And suddenly I was thrust into this, you're either in the medical system, the healthcare system, or you're not. And suddenly I was thrust in the healthcare system. And I began thinking about Alzheimer's as an epidemic and wondering how, people like me with resources and networks and, the willingness and the time to actually research things, how other people were going to manage this when it was such a struggle for me. Right. And that brought me right up to this conference that I went to. And I realized I'm surrounded by MDs and PhDs. And yet I was telling them things they didn't know.
Which conference was this?
Oh, well, so it's my dear friend, Daniel Kraft.
Oh,
and, yeah, you guys know Daniel. And so he's extraordinary, an MD, entrepreneur, fighter pilot, would-be astronaut, all those things. And he's chair of medicine at Singularity University, and his conference is called Exponential Medicine. And it really did bring together, the people at the forefront of medicine and listening to them and realizing, these are people who've done 15 years, of specialized education to get to the top of their career, in addition to which they were expected to be, hackers and entrepreneurs and, all these other things. But I looked around and I realized these people literally have the power to transform our species. And they now have the technology to do so within my lifetime. And it was right around the same time that, Jennifer Doudna, Emmanuel Charpentier were, and Feng Zheng and George Church were all working on CRISPR technologies. And I just sort of realized that, the world is on the verge of a massive change, akin to the one that started 25 or 30 years ago. And there's a lot of ways that you can surf that wave of change. I think a lot of people think making bets on startup companies is a way to do that. Other people want to fund the research. Other people want to do whatever. In my case, it was just instinct to just start telling the stories, on one hand, help the neuroscientist understand what's happening in this other field that could pertain to her research. The role that genetics plays in everything, the role that the microbiome plays in everything. And yet you talk to people in molecular biology and their field, to become advance in their field, they go deeper and deeper and deeper into a hole. Whereas in fact, what we need are the people who are skilled in at least two different disciplines and who can look across the tops of all these silos, and see the few other people who've managed to crawl to the top of the silo and look out and sort of encourage those conversations. So NeoLife was really my response to that. It was a way to sort of be a place where those ideas could be discussed, where the research could be expressed in layman's terms, because just because you are a neuroscientist doesn't mean that you know the language of genetics or the microbiome or longevity studies. And then as a secondary audience, the people who are the first ones to be confronted with these opportunities for change or improvement. So, I realized that I was getting that because I'm healthy, because I don't have a condition that requires, a doctor's engagement. I tend to get or up until NeoLife, I was getting all of my health knowledge basically from my body worker, my yoga teacher, my, dermatologist or my esthetician. And those people have, their understanding of things, but lots of times, again, aren't connected to the leading edge, aren't connected beyond things that might be, they might be commercially incentivized to pay attention to. So I wanted it to also be a place for, for me, the chief medical officer of myself and my own family.
Mhm. That's great. I mean, this is super important, the emergence of neo-life and educating the public in very layman's terms on all these so-called future technologies, things that are relevant to our bodies and our health in these times. And we experience every day in our world at IndieBio. It's very normal. Them talking about the microbiome or neuroscience, but we cannot make the assumption that the general public understands this. And so demystifying it is so important. And especially in times like this, when biology or biotech has really come front and center in the world, thanks to the pandemic. And so I wanted to ask you how the pandemic has either accelerated some of these technologies, highlighted them. How has that impacted this neobiological frontier that we're at?
Well, I think up until the pandemic, most people thought viruses were things that they didn't have to understand. I think the entire world has learned more about virology and epidemiology and the immune system than anybody would ever have aspired to teach in such a short amount of time. So I think there's that. I think the missing piece though is how it isn't just relevant vis-a-vis, COVID, that in fact, this is the tip of the iceberg that signals our transition from an industrial economy to a bioeconomy. And I don't think that story has been told yet. I don't think the pandemic has sensitized people to that. I think that's still, the work that companies like you guys and like we still have to work on. I think the most important thing though was to give people a sense that they are engaged in science, that science is important to their individual health and their futures. And so I think in that sense, it's been really good. On the other, side of the coin, the people who already understood that, I think the benefits of the pandemic have been extraordinary. We did a story, in our newsletter, which we also publish on the website, called Silver Linings, Pandemic Silver Linings. And, what are the good things that have come out of it? And, I was enormously moved by the sense of altruism that characterized the early response to the pandemic. And I think it's opened the doors to collaboration on a previously unimaginable level. Clearly there's a lot of money that will be spent on developing the vaccines and manufacturing and distributing the vaccines. So we will see all of that corporate interest and academic interests come into play. But the first and foremost incentive was for everyone to collaborate. And so we saw a sharing of data. We saw a relaxation of intellectual property. We saw, communication and collaboration across departments and across countries and other boundaries that I don't think we would have seen under other circumstances. And so I think that understanding, and we see this with CRISPR too, right? There's a willingness to share core technologies, in a possibly non-financial situation in order to advance the science, advance the technology, and advance the opportunities for everybody. So I'm super excited about that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the concept of collaboration. I don't think we have a lot of time looking at the next few decades with climate change and things are happening so rapidly. It is so important that we are really communicating and collaborating. And that's one of the missions of the Genesis Consortium and bringing together people like yourself who are working together. And as I said, the first thing comes to really educating people on, what the bioeconomy potential is and how we can look forward with a positive outlook. There are so many incredible opportunities out there to rethink the way that we are living in this world. And so I wanted to know, what are the biggest fears you've come across in your journey here when you're talking about this new frontier?
You know, I don't know. I don't know how we divide as a species into those whose first response to a new idea is excitement and exploration, and those whose first response to a new idea is fear and retreat. But I think that's what we're looking at. You could look at journalists. The role of journalists is often to be skeptical, right? There's that famous thing where the journalists are supposed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so, the idea that there's some big, huge scientific or technological innovation with a lot of money behind it, the journalists and therefore the people who often shape our attitudes about these things throw up all the things that could go wrong. And I think that, is important on a certain level, as long as it's balanced with significant appreciation of what could go right. So, synthetic biology is the thing that seems to terrify people the most. Synthetic biology, writ large, and genetic engineering in particular. I understand the fear that there will be unhappy people who will use these tools in deadly ways, and I understand the importance of biosecurity, and I appreciate even grudgingly sometimes how the U.S. government, for instance, sees some of the business and scientific exchanges with China as threatening to U.S. national interests. I can see that argument, and I'm sympathetic to that argument. But it's also a little bit like saying, we have to regulate the knife because you just don't know what someone's going to do with the knife. So, at this point, I think we have to accept the fact that developing these technologies involves risk of us doing something unknown, unintended consequences, used by some disaffected, person in hideous ways. I think the other thing, but to finish that thought, we have to take that risk because the opportunities for solving, curing disease, preventing inherited diseases, expanding the crop yields, reducing the inputs required for our crops, increasing the nutritional value of those crops. I mean, it just goes straight down the line, replacing energy sources with less extractive and polluted ones, on and on and on. You kind of have to just move forward carefully and in a small way to see what happens and correct quickly. So it's not the same thing as move fast and break things, right? It's move slowly and carefully and correct quickly. And I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, well, I think what you're doing right now is very courageous in telling these stories. I recently saw a map of the biggest exports from all the countries in the world, and petroleum is our biggest export, as is many other countries in the world. And so we are up against some very big stakeholders that we have to, if we're going to look towards a future with clean tech and sustainable technologies, we have to really be bold and courageous and do this together. So what, in your opinion, are the biggest policy shifts that need to happen to support this new era that we're heading into, the IndieBio?
Yeah. When I look back at the things that were transformative for the digital revolution, clearly DARPA's investment in the internet unleashed an extraordinary amount of innovation. And of course, before that, the development of space age technology accelerated a lot of that in communications. And, before that, the development of the first computers. So, I do think there is a role for governments to play. in terms of how they allocate research dollars. I look at the $4 trillion we spend on healthcare, almost 4 trillion next year. And, I can't help but wonder if we couldn't just eliminate some of the waste and, rationalize that system with incentives that make more sense, putting the patient and community health first, and then incentivizing things that maximize patient and community health. And then using some of those research dollars to support regenerative medicine initiatives, genetic engineering initiatives, clean biotech initiatives. That would be incredibly exciting. In terms of policy, we cannot shut down experimentation with scary stuff. So I think we need to wade in eyes wide open with a tremendous amount of transparency and a tremendous amount of inclusivity in terms of, stakeholders brought to the table to have difficult conversations about the shades of gray, that exist. And, there are people in my life who always want to leap to the logical conclusion. And we can't leap to the logical conclusion with biology, right? I mean, there's so many unknowns. And so we have to take it somewhat incrementally and come up with regulations somewhat iteratively. And so, I see the Keystone Policy Center has been doing a lot of really good work with their conference, CRISPR-Con, in pulling together, different groups that are engaged to have those conversations. And then the missing piece is the public. There's so much disinformation out there, whether it's the anti-vaxxers or whether it's the GMO project that goes around the grocery store stamping everything with an anti-GMO project stamp, which leads consumers to believe that, oh my God, GMO food is everywhere and there's just these few things that don't have GMO, whereas in fact, at the moment, it's still quite the opposite. And I think we need to, help integrate science into our curriculum, at every level of schools and education in order to understand, what the opportunity for science is to improve our world. I look at a company like Monsanto, who did some amazing science and some really bad business. Mm-hmm. And so, I think understanding the difference between good science and hopeful technology and bad business practices and bad communications skills is really important to help kind of pave the way for the big changes that we can make now.
And what are some of the big ethical debates do you think are the most important to be talking about right now, say in a global setting?
There are so many. I just picked up a copy of my friend Juan Enrique's book, Right, Wrong, and how technology transforms ethics. And I think, first of all, understanding ethics and how they happen, how they come about is really important because, we are particularly, how can I say this, judgmental today. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a highly evolved sense of indignation about a lot of things that you sort of wonder where that indignation was, or more to the point, how it was able to be buried for so long. And I do credit the millennials with having surfaced a lot of this. And we've known for decades that this generation was likely to be the one that would bring up these ethical issues, these moral issues, and question how women could have allowed themselves to be manipulated for so long, or how we could have allowed men to use their power over women for so long, or how we could have allowed people of color, to sort of remain oppressed and to not understand the different ways in which our structures were stacked against them. So I do credit them for bringing that up. On the other hand, using 21st century ethical standards to judge things, 50 or 100 or 200 years ago is a real risk. And so I think Juan's book does a really good job of sort of laying this out of how to be open-minded while preserving our moral values at the same time. So it's going to be tricky. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are one planet. We are one species now, like it or not. And, while we probably will never evolve one global moral code, I think our culturally specific code, our national codes, our whatever your subgroup is, I think we have to respect the fact that other people may differ. Reasonable people may actually come to completely different conclusions about things. And so I think, not imposing our morality on other people is something we're probably not very good at here in America, right? We've always felt that democracy and freedom and individual liberty, were the best ways forward for everybody, and wanted to make sure the rest of the world, got that message. But the rest of the world may not want our moral code, our ethical code. They may not want our, commitment to capitalism. I look at the Chinese and, I wonder about the fact that the social contract is seen by many people as beneficial. Many Chinese people prefer to have a more orderly society. Similarly, Chinese, CRISPR scientists would more likely terminate a pregnancy that would result in a deaf child, for instance. Whereas in America, a deaf family would welcome another deaf child into the community. So that's just one of the most stark examples of how we can differ in our ethics. But
Yeah, that brings me to the next question is about what we can learn from other countries. Are there other countries, in your opinion, that are doing things really well and we can learn from them?
yes, I, it's been, I must say, I have been through a very interesting transformation, from the digital revolution to the neobiological revolution. Um, you know, I lived in Europe for 10 years and then came to America. And, the cyber libertarian mentality was one I was pretty comfortable with. The idea that, Washington could regulate what was happening in cyberspace was the subject of much publication in Wired Magazine and a lot of other places as well. Um, but I think this is different, right? Because now we are talking about what is already highly regulated. Our medical systems are highly regulated. Our food systems are highly regulated. So it's not about this wide open frontier that has no laws or no police activity going on. We're walking into a place that exists, but we've got all new situations to consider. So, there's a really interesting survey of the different health and medical systems around the world. Right now it's like arbitrage. You can go to certain countries for much more exotic treatments because they don't have the same, regulatory requirements as, for instance, the US FDA. I'm thinking about longevity trials in countries like Colombia. I'm thinking of cosmetic surgeries in places like Thailand. I'm thinking of clinical trials in places like Mexico or Australia. And, it's, again, using our ethical and moral high ground, we could say, these protections exist for a reason and you shouldn't be trying to get around them. On the other hand, there's a lot of reasons why these regulations exist, and they could be driven by corporate interests as much as having your best interests at heart. So,
And some of them are very antiquated. I mean, we've been around and nobody has really tried to change them. And so we're in an entirely different present now. So
exactly. So it is much more of a buyer beware kind of situation, I think. The Europeans are far more advanced in, for instance, IVF, the use of IVF. I feel like they are perhaps more practical on a certain level. I think in America, of course, America was founded by religious zealots. So I think that exists. I think our healthcare system is really expensive. and insurance is unlikely to reimburse those types of births or births using that kind of technology. Whereas some of the Nordic countries, Holland and Norway, for instance, are, first of all, more likely to support families in general and women after birth or families after birth. But they're also more likely to pay for some of that technology in the first place. So that's one example.
They're also moving forward with psychedelic medicine at a much faster rate, I think, in Europe.
I don't know. After the 2020 elections, Americans made a big, about face in terms of the war on drugs.
What do you think contributed to that? Was it a variety of studies or just people having experiences?
It's a really good question. I do think the fact that there is now, there are randomized controlled trials, from institutions like Johns Hopkins and New York University and so forth. I think honestly, there's a lot of money to be made. I think the decriminalization of cannabis was a real eye opener, and the opportunity to build a whole new liquor industry has probably had a huge impact on that. I also think that the amount of money we spend on pharmaceuticals to control mental illness and anguish with diminishing results, I think is the source of great frustration, lost productivity, billions of dollars in investment for a result that, if you have a mental illness and are prescribed an SSRI, you have a 1 in 3 chance of that first drug they give you actually working. And we have very few good tools for actually identifying who is a candidate for which drug. There is some really interesting work in neuroscience along those lines in terms of predictive models of which drug might work best for you. But the idea that instead of taking something for the rest of your life, you could have, an acute kind of intervention that could open your mind and change it forever, I think is a pretty compelling proposition.
So many people are suffering from trauma, and trauma is a key factor in disease and all sorts of things, productivity. So I think it's a really interesting and very important time that we're at right now.
Trauma, anxiety, all of that, absolutely.
As we're looking forward to this new future, what is your personal mission? Like, what gets you up in the morning and you say, yes, this is like, I need to be, say, a light bringer in this particular area?
Well, as I said, I think there is so much work to be done in terms of connecting the dots and painting a bigger picture of how each one of these individual, companies or inventions or discoveries, what role does that play in, the future that we're building? And when I say the future, it's not just, the world around us. It's like the future us, what is the future of our species as we begin to engineer our brains, we engineer our bodies, we engineer our children, we engineer our environment, we engineer our food, how will this change us? And who's having those conversations? I want a seat at that table. I want to be having those conversations. I want to find the people who are most likely to have the biggest impact on the future of our species and engage them with conversations about how to make sure this goes well. And I get up every morning, wanting to find the people doing that work. I also want to find best practices. What are the solutions? What are the things that have the best chance of, creating a cleaner world, a more sustainable world, a healthier species, perhaps a more diverse species, and highlight those things and make them less terrifying to people. And I have to tell you the story. So I started asking that question. I started asking all of these scientists and investors that I was meeting. I was like, so your technology is going to transform humans? And they'd say, yeah. And I said, so what's your vision for the future of our species? And they'd go, oh, good question. And I was like, really? You didn't start with like a creative brief, and then like work back for, a strategic plan, your product roadmap, like how are we going to get there? And, fantastic dinner parties ensued. And ultimately, ended up in the creation of this book. And in the process of creating the book, we decided to do a workshop. And we said, what does the future of our species look like? And how are we going to get there? And how quickly are we going to get there? Mm-hmm. And so we invited Peter Schwartz, who is a master of scenario planning. He's been doing scenario planning since the oil crisis of the 70s. Mm-hmm. And Hanu Rajanimi, who is both a synthetic biology CEO and also an extraordinarily talented science fiction author who knows how to build future worlds and think about that. And we invited an assortment of other, brilliant scientists and artists and futurists. And we came together for a 2-day workshop, at the end of which we came up with 4 scenarios for the future of our species that differed in the way that biotechnologies would develop. And so, one was something would happen, something religious or political or biological or technological would squash the kind of innovation that we've been seeing over the past 15 years. The second was, we would have not unbridled, but the biotech revolution would, gather speed as long as we were only using it to cure disease. The third scenario was, we start to use it to enhance people beyond whatever might be considered a baseline. And the fourth was, biotechnologies can enable us to do things that humans can't otherwise do. Mm-hmm. And we asked Hanu to do a piece of science fiction for us based on these scenarios. And, Hanu and I had been talking about the dearth of positive visions for our future, especially a biotechnology future, because, the nature of science fiction is, dystopian, and that kind of conflict and drama makes for good storytelling. And so when I said, okay, Hanu, why don't you go do this story for us? The story he came back with was terrifying to people, even though he didn't intend for it to be. Mm-hmm. It's hard not to be terrified by the kind of change we're looking at. Yeah. And so a big part of my personal mission is to build credible, positive visions for the future so that we can try them on and get comfortable with them and, understand how this is going to change us and help us evolve a vision for where we want it to go. Because we really didn't do a very good job of that with the digital revolution. Mm. We thought whatever was good for the internet was good for humanity. And I think with the biotech revolution, we have to think very carefully about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really beautiful, and a beautiful end note, Jane. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing around telling these stories and the positive vision. As you said, oftentimes sounds like science fiction. It's actually real. It's actually happening. And we need to paint it in the light of possibility versus what could, be bad for humanity. And we also need to continue that narrative of how do we advance as a human species? Because that's essentially what we are. We're not separated. We're not divided by nations. Right now, we are actually on a path to trying to save our species. And so I really appreciate you keeping these conversations in the global arena. And I hope to have that we can all have a seat at that table to really get people to talk about the things that are most important. I mean, there's so much noise right now. So thank you.
So much noise. And, I think it's also important to help understand like where we are today versus the terrifying thing that you're afraid of, and how long is it going to take us to get there, and how many mistakes and failures, there will be along the way. I think that's another really important piece of this.
Yes. So for the audience who's watching right now, please do visit Neo.Life. You can also read the book Neo.Life, and just follow, educate yourself, spread the word. Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks so much.